The music drifted across the twilight fields, a swirling melody that seemed to ride the evening breeze. Corporal Miklos Kovacs stood frozen at the edge of the camp fence, his fingers wrapped around the wire as the sounds of laughter, distant yet clear, floated toward him from beyond the perimeter. In the gathering darkness, he could make out the glow of 1,000 lights twinkling like fallen stars in a field just beyond the watchtowers. The rhythmic thump of a bass drum pulsed through the summer air, accompanied by the high, sweet notes of violins, and something else, something that made his breath catch in his throat, the unmistakable sound of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of human voices raised in joy. "Come see," he whispered to Ferenc, his bunkmate, who approached hesitantly. "Listen to it."
"What kind of place is this where such sounds exist during war?" The two Hungarian prisoners had arrived at Camp Ellis in Illinois only 3 weeks earlier, part of a transport of captured soldiers from the Eastern Front. They had been prepared for many things: interrogation, hard labor, perhaps even torture. But nothing had prepared them for this, the distant roar of celebration that now filled the night air, drowning out even the soft padding of the guards' footsteps behind them. "It's the county fair," the American guard said casually, chewing on a stick of gum. "Happens every summer. You boys will probably get to see it up close if you're assigned to the work detail tomorrow." Miklos turned, his face a mask of confusion. County fair? During wartime? The guard shrugged, as though the question itself made no sense. "Sure, why would we cancel the fair?"
People need something to look forward to. As darkness settled fully over the camp, Miklos lay awake in his bunk, the strange music still echoing in his ears. In Hungary, there had been no celebrations for years, no gatherings, no music in the streets, no laughter that wasn't hushed and fearful. Food was rationed, fuel was scarce, and every resource was channeled toward the war effort. Yet here, in the heart of America, thousands of civilians apparently gathered freely to dance and celebrate while their sons fought and died an ocean away. What kind of nation could wage global war while still finding time for fairground music and dancing under summer stars? The question haunted him as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, the distant melodies weaving through his dreams like ghosts from a world he thought no longer existed. What would he witness tomorrow, and how would it compare to everything he'd been told about his American captors? When the morning came, 20 prisoners were selected for a work detail, and Miklos found himself among them. Their task, to help with cleanup and maintenance at the Fulton County Fair, which had begun 3 days earlier and would continue through the weekend. As they climbed into the back of an open-air truck, Miklos noticed something odd about his fellow prisoners. Gone was the hollow-eyed resignation that had marked their faces since capture. Instead, there was a nervous energy, an almost childlike curiosity. The truck rumbled through the countryside, passing fields of corn that stretched to the horizon, fields that seemed to go on forever, uninterrupted by bomb craters or artillery positions. Ferenc, seated beside him, gripped the wooden bench with white knuckles. "Remember what the political officers told us," he muttered. "The Americans will try to break us with false displays of plenty. It's all propaganda, meant to weaken our resolve." Miklos nodded, but said nothing. He had heard the same warnings, that if captured, they would be shown artificial scenes of prosperity designed to undermine their faith in their homeland. They had been told that America was a land of desperate inequality, where a few lived in luxury while the masses starved. He had believed it because he had no reason not to. Now, watching endless fields of abundant crops slide past, he felt the first hairline crack in that certainty. The truck turned onto a wider road, and suddenly the fairgrounds appeared before them. Miklos had expected something modest, perhaps a few tents, a small gathering, but what sprawled across the vast field made his breath catch. Dozens of colorful structures dotted the landscape, flags and banners fluttering in the morning breeze. A massive Ferris wheel, its metal frame gleaming in the sunlight, towered above everything. Surrounding it were countless smaller attractions, carousels with painted horses, game booths with prizes displayed, long tables laden with food, and everywhere, people, not hundreds, thousands.
American families moved through the fairgrounds in waves, their clothing bright and varied. Children raced ahead of parents, clutching cotton candy that dissolved into pink clouds as they bit into it. Teenagers gathered in laughing clusters, their voices carrying across the fields. Elderly couples strolled arm in arm, pausing to watch younger people dance to music that poured from speakers mounted on poles. "This cannot be real," Ferenc whispered, his previous certainty crumbling visibly. "There must be some explanation." The guard who had accompanied them overheard and chuckled. "What's not real about it? It's just the county fair. Been happening every summer since before my grandfather was born." As the prisoners were divided into work groups, Miklos found himself assigned to help at the dance pavilion, a large wooden structure with a polished floor where, each evening, hundreds of locals gathered to dance to live music. His job was simple: to sweep the floor, arrange chairs along the perimeter, and help the band set up their equipment. While he worked, Miklos could not stop staring at the fairgoers who passed by. They moved with an ease he found almost shocking. No furtive glances over shoulders, no hushed conversations. Children laughed openly. Old men argued politics without lowering their voices. Young women walked unaccompanied, their summer dresses bright splashes of color against the dusty ground. In Budapest, he thought, people move through the streets like ghosts, always watching, always afraid. Here, even under the eyes of armed guards, American civilians seemed to exist in a different reality, one where war was a distant concern, not the grinding daily presence it had become in Europe. A teenage girl approached the pavilion, glancing curiously at Miklos as he swept. She carried a paper cone filled with what appeared to be frozen cream, licking it casually as she watched him work. The insignia on his prisoner uniform clearly marked him as an enemy, yet she showed no fear, only mild interest. "You're one of the Hungarian prisoners, aren't you?" she asked, her voice neither hostile nor particularly friendly, just curious. Miklos nodded cautiously, his grasp of English limited but functional. "Yes, miss. My brother's fighting in Europe right now," she said matter-of-factly. "Somewhere in France, I think. Do you have family back home?" The question caught him off guard. This girl, whose brother might at this moment be killing his countrymen, asked about his family as casually as if inquiring about the weather. What world was this, where enemies could speak of such things without hatred burning between them? "A mother and sister," he answered after a moment's hesitation. "In Budapest." She nodded, taking another lick of her ice cream. "Well, I hope they're okay." Then, without further comment, she wandered away toward the Ferris wheel, leaving Miklos staring after her, the broom forgotten in his hands. What remained with him was not just the girl's words, but the ice cream she had eaten so casually, a luxury he hadn't seen in Hungary for years. And she had tossed the last bit away, half-finished, when something else caught her attention. The casual waste of it struck him more powerfully than any propaganda film ever could. As the day wore on, the fair grew more crowded. By mid-afternoon, the dance pavilion was being prepared for the evening's entertainment. Miklos watched in fascination as a band arrived, not military musicians playing patriotic marches, but ordinary men with instruments who joked and laughed as they set up their equipment. They tested microphones, adjusted drums, and played brief snippets of songs that made passing teenagers stop and sway to the rhythm. It was while helping to arrange chairs that Miklos overheard something that stopped him cold. Two elderly men sat nearby, arguing over the price of corn. 35 cents a bushel is highway robbery, one complained, slapping his knee for emphasis. "Before the war, we never paid more than 25. "Everything's gone up," his companion replied with a shrug. "But my Betty says we should be thankful. In Europe, they're starving." Miklos froze, the wooden chair suspended in his hands. 35 cents for a bushel of corn?
In Hungary, if corn could be found at all, it cost 20 times that amount, and even then it was strictly rationed. Yet here, these men complained about prices that seemed, to him, like a fantasy. As evening approached, the prisoners were gathered to return to camp, all except for Miklos and 4 others, who were instructed to remain and help serve refreshments during the dance. The guard explained that they would be returned to camp later that night. Ferenc cast Miklos a worried glance as he boarded the truck with the others, but Miklos found himself almost relieved to stay. He needed to see more of this impossible world that seemed to exist parallel to the one he had known. As darkness fell, the fair transformed. Thousands of electric lights illuminated the grounds, casting a warm glow over everything. In Europe, blackout conditions had been strictly enforced for years. The sight of so much light, used so freely, was almost painful to behold.
Miklos thought of Budapest, where even a single candle in a window could bring severe punishment, and felt a strange vertigo, as though the ground beneath his feet had suddenly tilted. Then the music began, and what followed would shake his understanding of America and of the war itself to its very foundations. The pavilion filled with people as darkness deepened, not dozens, but hundreds of them, flowing in like a human tide. Young women in colorful dresses with full skirts, men in pressed shirts with sleeves rolled up against the summer heat, elderly couples moving more slowly but with evident anticipation. Miklos stood in the corner, a tray of paper cups filled with lemonade balanced in his hands, watching with growing amazement as the crowd continued to swell. The band, 5 men with instruments, took their places on the small stage. No grand announcements, no ceremony, just a casual "evening, folks" from the leader before they launched into their first song. The effect was immediate and electric. Couples flooded onto the wooden floor, moving together in patterns that seemed both chaotic and orderly at once. The music, something quick and lively that Miklos had never heard before, filled the pavilion and spilled out into the night. "They call it swing," said a voice beside him. Miklos turned to find an older guard watching the dancers with a slight smile. "Been popular for years now. My daughter can dance to it for hours without getting tired." Miklos nodded, unable to find words. In Hungary, dancing had once been common at village festivals and family celebrations. But since the war began, such gatherings had ceased. The government discouraged frivolous activities that diverted energy from the war effort. Resources were too precious, the times too serious for such indulgences. Yet here, in the heart of America, a nation fully engaged in the same global conflict, thousands gathered to dance as though peace had never been disturbed. The disconnect was so profound that Miklos felt physically dizzy, as though two incompatible realities were colliding inside his mind. A young couple whirled past, the girl's skirt flaring out like a flower blooming in fast motion. They were laughing, their faces flushed with exertion and joy. The boy could not have been more than 17, the same age as many of the young recruits Miklos had seen sent to the front, their faces gray with fear. Yet this American boy danced with a girl in his arms, wore a distant shadow that barely touched his world. "How is this possible?" Miklos finally asked, gesturing toward the crowded dance floor. "Your country is at war. Your men are dying. How can there be," he struggled for the English word, "such celebration?" The guard seemed surprised by the question. "Well, sure, we're at war. That's why morale is important. Can't just sit around being miserable, can we? Besides, the fair only happens once a year." As the evening deepened, Miklos continued to serve lemonade, moving through the crowd like a ghost. No one seemed troubled by his prisoner uniform. At most, he received curious glances or polite nods. One elderly woman even thanked him when he handed her a cup, as though he were any ordinary server rather than a captured enemy soldier. What struck him most forcefully was not just the dancing, but the abundance that surrounded it. Refreshment tables groaned under the weight of foods he had not seen in years. Plates piled with sandwiches, bowls of fruit, trays of cookies and cakes. People ate casually, sometimes leaving half-finished plates behind when they returned to the dance floor. In a corner, a massive metal container dispensed ice for drinks, actual ice, in summer, used not for preserving essential medicines, but for cooling lemonade. Sergeant Tibor Nemeth, a hardened veteran who had fought from Stalingrad to the Romanian border before his capture, stood beside Miklos at the refreshment table, his weathered face locked in an expression of disbelief. "I was told," he said quietly in Hungarian, "that Americans lived in great poverty, that their wealth was a myth created by Jewish film producers, that ordinary people suffered while a few grew rich." He gestured toward the dance floor, where people of obviously different economic classes mingled freely. Farm boys in their best shirts, dancing alongside girls whose dresses spoke of greater means. "Look at them," Tibor continued. "The daughter of a banker dances with the son of a factory worker. A farmer's wife eats the same cake as a doctor's wife. What kind of warfare is this, where the enemy allows such things while fighting on two fronts?" Private Janos Varga, younger and more idealistic than the others, had a different reaction. Standing near the band, watching as they played song after song without any apparent political content, he whispered to Miklos, "Do you realize what this means? No propaganda in their music, no messages about sacrifice or duty, just music for joy. When did you last hear such a thing in Hungary?" Miklos could not remember. Even before the war, music had been increasingly harnessed to nationalist purposes. Folk songs were permitted, even encouraged, but entertainment for its own sake had been viewed with growing suspicion. Dance halls still existed in Budapest, but they were constantly monitored, the music carefully selected to reinforce appropriate values. Here, the band played whatever pleased the crowd. When they launched into a particularly lively number, a spontaneous cheer went up from the dancers. The pavilion vibrated with their energy, hundreds of feet striking the wooden floor in rhythm, the sound like rolling thunder. It was during this song that Miklos noticed something that cut through his amazement like a knife. At the edge of the dance floor, a young woman sat alone in a wheelchair. Beside her stood a man in uniform. Not a prisoner's uniform like his own, but the olive drab of an American soldier. His left sleeve was pinned up where an arm should have been. He was speaking to the woman, who smiled up at him with evident affection. As Miklos watched, the one-armed soldier held out his remaining hand to the woman. She hesitated, then took it, allowing him to help her rise unsteadily from the wheelchair. Together, they moved onto the floor, joining the dancers. She leaned heavily on him for support, and their movements were slow, awkward compared to the couples who spun around them. But they danced, their faces reflecting not the pain that had clearly touched both their lives, but a determined joy. The sight struck Miklos with unexpected force. In Hungary, the wounded were hidden away. Those maimed by war were seldom seen in public spaces, as though their broken bodies were a shameful reminder of sacrifice rather than a badge of honor. Yet here was this American soldier, openly displaying his wound, dancing despite it, and no one stared or turned away. Other couples simply adjusted their paths to give the pair more room. A lump formed in Miklos's throat, unexpected and unwelcome. Something about that dancing couple, moving slowly among the others, pierced through layers of propaganda and belief that had been built up over years. "Look there," he said to Tibor, nodding toward the couple. "The wounded dance alongside the whole." Tibor followed his gaze, his expression inscrutable. In Budapest, that man would be in a military hospital, hidden from public view. And the woman? The same. Or, at home, kept out of sight by her family. They watched in silence as the couple continued their slow, determined dance, occasionally bumped by faster dancers, but never falling, never retreating to the sidelines. "Perhaps," Tibor said finally, his voice so low that Miklos had to strain to hear it, "we have been told other falsehoods as well." As midnight approached, the band announced their final song. Rather than the fast-paced music that had dominated the evening, they began a slow, haunting melody. The crowd responded immediately, couples drawing close to one another, their movements becoming gentle, almost reverent. The mood in the pavilion shifted from exuberant celebration to something more intimate and tender. Miklos, exhausted from hours of serving refreshments, found a seat in the corner where he could observe the final dance. The guard, who had been watching him all evening, nodded, indicating that he could rest. From this vantage point, Miklos had a clear view of the entire floor. Hundreds of couples moving in slow circles, many with their eyes closed, as though the music had transported them to a private world where war and separation did not exist. He thought of his sister, Anna, who loved to dance. Before the war, she had often begged him to take her to the village festivals where local musicians played. Now she lived in a Budapest apartment with blackout curtains, queuing for hours to receive meager food rations, jumping at the sound of air raid sirens. When had she last danced? When had anyone in Hungary experienced a night like this? A night of abundance and music and carefree movement? As the final notes of the song faded, Miklos was startled to feel moisture on his cheeks. He wiped it away quickly, hoping the guard hadn't noticed. But the man was looking elsewhere, his attention caught by something outside the pavilion. The dancers began to disperse, calling goodnight to one another, making plans to return the following evening. They moved in the confident manner of people who expected tomorrow to unfold predictably, safely, people for whom war remained a distant reality rather than a daily presence. As the crowd thinned, Miklos and the other prisoners were gathered to return to camp. They climbed into the back of a military truck, their guard taking a seat near the tailgate. The engine rumbled to life and they pulled away from the fairgrounds, electric lights still blazing behind them, music still floating on the night air. No one spoke during the ride back to Camp Ellis. What could they say? They had witnessed something that defied everything they had been told about America, and, by extension, everything they had been told about the war itself. The thousands of dancers, the abundance of food, the casual use of electricity, the wounded who moved freely among the whole, these images would remain with them long after the night had ended. For Miklos, one thought eclipsed all others. If their captors lived in such plenty that they could maintain county fairs in wartime, what chance had Hungary ever had against such a nation? What chance had any of the Axis powers? But it was not the might of America that had shaken him most deeply. It was the realization that the enemy he had been taught to hate lived lives not so different from what he had once known. Lives filled with music and laughter and simple pleasures. Lives worth protecting. As they passed through the camp gates, returning to the barbed wire enclosure that would be their home for the duration of the war, Miklos looked back at the distant glow of the fairgrounds on the horizon. Tomorrow, he knew, thousands would gather there again to dance under the summer stars, their movements free and unhindered by the terrible weight that had pressed down on Europe for years. And somehow, the knowledge of that freedom, even if he could not share in it, felt strangely like a kind of hope.